A Cuban medical brigade sent to the Italian city of Crema to combat the novel coronavirus has returned to Cuba. This Monday saw George Floyd's memorial at the Fountain of Praise Church in Houston, Texas. The European Union launched a humanitarian air corridor to support the fight against the coronavirus in the Democratic Republic of Congo. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. A Cuban medical brigade sent to the Italian city of Crema to combat the novel coronavirus has completed its mission and has returned to Cuba. 36 doctors, 15 nurses and a logistics specialist departed from Milan Malpensa airport this Monday after having spent 2 months helping to save lives in the Italian city. The medical brigade was greeted on arriving at Havana's international airport by Cuban health authorities, and President Miguel Díaz-Canel sent his greetings via video link. The brigade performed over 5,000 medical consultations, 3,600 nursing services, and was directly responsible for the recovery and discharge of 210 patients. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro stressed on Monday during an interview broadcast on the Entre Valores program that the consolidation of peace in the country has allowed the Venezuelan people to overcome the difficulties generated by the United States blockade.
The gasoline problem that we had faced is a consequence of the United States chasing our supplies and fuel tankers for a year, and in the end, in February or March, it managed to take all the tankers from us. But it did not count on our cunning, as some say. We rebuilt ourselves because we had peace, and our people patiently assumed with consciousness that situation in a stoic manner. And we managed to bring the gasoline for several months and produce it here in the country. We have the elements, the supplies. With peace, everything is possible. I have faced 1,000 conspiracies, even a drone attack.
And the Venezuelan president confirmed that the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America will discuss its vision of the world post-COVID-19 in the next few days.
In 2 days, we have a presidential video conference with the presidents and prime ministers of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America. The central point is to discuss the post-pandemic future of our countries, of our Latin American and Caribbean alliance. Hope is alive. The people are united. We will get through these moments of treason and we will take up the original project. That is none other than the project of Bolívar.
Ecuadorians took to the streets again on Monday in the third day of protests against the newly announced economic measures of the Lenin Moreno government. 2 laws were recently approved by the National Assembly. The first seeks to make working hours in the country more flexible, and the second seeks to reduce salaries. Social organisations and trade unions are demanding that President Lenin Moreno reverse these economic measures, which they stress only hurt workers and vulnerable social sectors. Around 3,000 demonstrators mobilised to also denounce the mass layoffs taking place across Ecuador since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thousands of Brazilians took to the streets in recent days to protest against police violence, racism and the Jair Bolsonaro government's mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our correspondent Brian Meir has the details.
A bad week for Brazil's far-right president Jair Bolsonaro, which included him being publicly humiliated by his political idol Donald Trump, culminated in, for the second week in a row, massive anti-fascist protests in Brazil's largest cities. Now, since the lockdown orders and the quarantines began, Sunday has been a day which has seen massive media coverage given to very small fascist protests in favor of shutting down the Supreme Court, in favor of military intervention, and Bolsonaro publicly appeared at many of them, hugging protesters without a mask on, in a sign of defiance against the governor's attempts to protect their citizens from his genocidal COVID-19 program, which is based on essentially herd mentality. For the second week in a row, this Sunday in cities across Brazil, the anti-fascist protests dwarfed those of Bolsonaro's supporters. In Sao Paulo, The military police, which has a very long history of lowballing the size estimates of left-wing protests, put the anti-fascist protest at 3,000. Eyewitnesses say this was much larger than that. Nevertheless, the biggest newspapers in the city estimated the crowd sizes at the pro-Bolsonaro protests of 50 to 100 people. In other words, even in the most conservative estimates, the size of the anti-Bolsonaro protests was 30 times larger than that of the pro-Bolsonaro protests.
Chilean health authorities reported over 6,400 new COVID-19 cases on Sunday, representing a record high. The latest figures bring the total number of cases identified to over 130,000, while the death toll stands at over 2,000. The Chilean health minister noted that over 1,300 patients are currently connected to ventilators, of which more than 370 remain in a critical condition. Meanwhile, a quarantine has been declared in the Chilean cities of Calamar and San Antonio starting this Tuesday. The opposition People's Progressive Party was declared the winner of the March 2nd general and regional elections in Guyana after 3 months of delays and alleged irregularities during the polls. The Guyana Elections Commission confirmed the victory of presidential candidate Mohamed Irfan Ali after the recount of the final ballot box from the decisive Region 4 concluded on Sunday. The People's Progressive Party obtained 15,500 votes to secure the majority of the 65 seats in Guyana's National Assembly and beat its closest rival, a Partnership for National Unity Alliance for Change, to replace current President David Granger. The vote recount was monitored by representatives of all the 9 political parties that contested the elections, together with local observers, CARICOM and OAS representatives. St Kitts and Nevis welcomed Timothy Harris's second term as Prime Minister after winning the elections held on June 5th. Upon being sworn in on Sunday, Harris called on the population to make this Federation of Caribbean Islands an example of a small and better managed island state. The Team Unity Coalition won 9 of 11 seats in Parliament, securing another 5-year term for the Prime Minister. The Caribbean community described the victory as resounding and congratulated the population for the calm and peaceful elections despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization warned on Monday that the coronavirus pandemic is getting worse worldwide and stressed that the biggest threat now is complacency, as mass gatherings have resumed in several countries.
Although the situation in Europe is improving, globally it's worsening. More than 100,000 cases have been reported on 9 of the past 10 days. Yesterday, more than 136 cases were reported, the most in a single day so far. More than 6 months into this pandemic, this is not the time for any country to take its foot off the pedal. This is the time for countries to continue to work hard.
Likewise, the WHO Director General expressed support for the global movement against racism, but encouraged demonstrators to do so safely.
WHO fully supports equality and the global movement against racism. We reject discrimination of all kinds. We encourage all those protesting around the world to do so safely. As much as possible, keep at least 1 meter from others. Clean your hands, cover your cough, and wear a mask if you attend a protest.
More stories coming up after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. This Monday saw George Floyd's memorial at the Fountain of Praise Church in Houston, Texas. Meanwhile, the Minneapolis police officer who killed him has seen his bail set at $1.25 million. Our correspondent in Washington, Jorge Gestoso, has the details.
Thank you. At this hour in a church in Houston, Texas, a casket of George Floyd is being exposed during 6 hours, so the people of the city where he lived most of the time could say the last goodbye before his burial tomorrow. At the same time, in Minneapolis, the policeman who assassinated George Floyd Through a video conference presented in court, he has been accused of murder in the second degree and manslaughter, and his bail has been set up in $1.25 million. And at the same time, there were some demonstrations all over the city and all over the country for the 14th day in a row. In Minneapolis, the city council has decided to disband the police and is in favor to reorganize the armed force in that city in terms of establishing what they call a community-based public safety model. We get back to you now.
George Floyd's family has appealed to the United Nations to intervene in the investigation of his death and to send recommendations for systemic police reform in the United States. In a June 3rd letter to the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, the family, represented by civil rights attorney Ben Crump, urged the UN to investigate Floyd's death and encouraged the US government to press federal criminal charges against the officers involved. They requested reforms including de-escalating techniques, independent prosecutions and autopsies for every police killing. Crump said in a statement that the United States has a long pattern and practice of depriving black citizens of the fundamental human right to life. Democratic lawmakers plan to unveil a sweeping package of legislation to combat police violence and racial injustice in the US after 2 weeks of nationwide protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis City Police. Congressional Black Caucus Chair Karen Bass said she hoped the wave of largely peaceful protests seen across the United States over the past 2 weeks would increase pressure on lawmakers to act. It is unclear if the proposal will receive support from Republicans who control the US Senate, as their support and that of President Donald Trump would be needed for the measures to become law. Meanwhile, the number of coronavirus cases in the United States has now surpassed 2 million, by far the highest number in the world. The COVID-19 death toll now stands at over 112,000. Officials have expressed concern about a second wave of cases that could be coupled with the protests against systemic racism and police brutality across the country. Moscow, Russia's most affected city by the novel coronavirus, will end all lockdown measures imposed on the population since March on June 9th. The announcement was made on Monday by the mayor of the city, Sergei Sobyanin, who confirmed that from Tuesday the lockdown and safe conduct system will be lifted. The mayor stressed that Moscow will return to its usual pace of life and that the city's public and entertainment venues will open in phases through to the end of June. Likewise, Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin announced on Monday that the country will partially reopen its borders.
An order of the government has been signed, which allows Russian citizens to leave the country to take care of sick relatives living in other states, as well as for those who are going to work or study. Departure is also possible for Russians who need to receive medical care abroad.
Spain has reported that 52% of the country's population, or some 25 million people, have entered the final stage of exiting the strict lockdown imposed to contain the spread of the novel coronavirus. According to Health Minister Salvador Illa, more than half of the residents of this European nation will enter the fourth stage of the lifting of measures, the last step before what the government has called the new normality. The minister stressed at a press conference that in the country's autonomous communities, they will recover full administrative control during this last stage of the lifting of restrictions. Authorities in the United Kingdom have introduced a 2-week quarantine from Monday for anyone arriving from abroad in an attempt to limit the spread of the coronavirus. British residents and overseas visitors will have to comply with the 14-day self-isolation rules or face a £1,000 fine. Surprise visits will be used to check they are following the rules at the address previously supplied. The United Kingdom is the hardest hit by COVID-19 in Europe, yet the government is pushing to lift lockdown measures, with thousands of workers already forced to go back to work and primary schools reopened. Meanwhile, British Airways and budget carriers EasyJet and Ryanair have launched joint legal proceedings against the government over what they called a disproportionate and unfair step. The CEO of London's Heathrow Airport claimed the quarantine move could lead to the loss of 25,000 jobs, or a third of staff at the airport. Torrential rains have struck cities in South and East China over the past 2 days, with many residents trapped due to flooding. The continuous rain has flooded many parts of Guilin City in South China's Jiangxi Shuang Autonomous Region. Firefighters evacuated 7 villagers trapped in their homes in a township in Lingui district on Monday. Heavy rains also hit Qingyang City in South China's Guangdong province, while some roads were inundated by floodwaters in Fugan County. China hit back at US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo over his accusations that the country was capitalizing on civil unrest in the US. This comes as the Trump administration stepped up its anti-China rhetoric in regards to Beijing's response to the pandemic and its moves to enact more control over the special administrative region of Hong Kong. Without naming Pompeo, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Huan Chongyin said that non-interference in internal affairs is a consistent basic principle of China's diplomacy. In a tweet, Pompeo accused China of attempting to exploit George Floyd's death and the anti-racism protests that have followed for its own political gain.
Unlike the US, non-interference in internal affairs is a consistent basic principle of China's diplomacy. We hope that all parties, including the US, will abide by this principle. The relevant US politicians ignore serious problems in his own country and is obsessed with buck-passing games to shift responsibility, which is very immoral and will not help solve their own problems. We hope that he will not waste any more precious time.
Vietnam has ratified a significant trade deal with the European Union, which is expected to boost the country's manufacturing sector and exports as it recovers from a downturn caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Lawmakers approved the agreement after they met in the National Assembly for the first time since the pandemic began. The deal had been signed in Hanoi last June and was ratified by the European Parliament in February. When it takes effect next month, the EU will lift 85% of its tariffs on Vietnamese goods, while Vietnam will lift 49% of its import duties on EU exports and phase out the rest over 10 years. And Vietnam has now seen 52 days without reporting any new local COVID-19 cases. According to health authorities, there have been no new local infections since April 16th, and all the 189 cases that have been confirmed recently are citizens who were repatriated from other nations. In addition, the country is one of the few in the world that, despite reporting over 300 cases, has not reported a single COVID-19 death. And we're taking one last break now, but stay with us for more. Welcome back to From the South. The European Union launched a humanitarian air corridor to support the fight against the coronavirus in the Democratic Republic of the Congo on Sunday. Flights will carry at least 40 tons of aid, such as water purifiers and medical supplies, provided by EU governments and humanitarian agencies. According to official numbers, Africa has so far been spared the worst of the pandemic, with only 4,755 COVID-19 deaths recorded and some 170,000 cases reported across the continent. Poorer countries like the DRC would struggle to cope if the outbreak intensifies, and Brussels has set aside €3.25 billion in grants and €1.4 billion in loans to help countries through the crisis. Nearly 200 people rallied in front of the US Embassy in the administrative capital of South Africa, Pretoria, on Monday, chanting "Down with racism, down with Donald Trump, and down with imperialism," in solidarity with the global Black Lives Matter campaign. Simultaneous demonstrations were also organised in Johannesburg and Cape Town.
We are standing here in front of the offices of murderers who think they've got power to tell us how we should conduct ourselves. That Africans and blacks in general are not subhuman. They are full human beings. And therefore, you cannot be behind Black Lives Matter and still see an opportunity to destroy another black person.
The majority of schools in South Africa welcomed back students on Monday as COVID-19 restrictions were eased in the country. Pupils between grades 7 and 12 were the first to return to classes. Ahead of their return, hand sanitizer dispensers were installed and desks were separated to maintain social distancing measures. Over 48,000 people have tested positive for COVID-19 in South Africa, while 998 deaths have been reported. Kenya has banned all single-use plastics, such as water bottles and straws, in its national parks, beaches, forests and other protected areas. Announced a year ago, the enactment of this measure was confirmed by the country's Minister of Tourism in a letter sent to industry representatives last week. The move comes 3 years after the ban on plastic bags in Kenya, one of the strictest in the world, and came into effect on World Environment Day.
First announced a year ago, was ordered in a letter from Tourism Minister.
Places of worship, restaurants, malls and state borders across India will be reopened, despite the fact the country has just reported its highest single-day death toll. India's 10-week-long lockdown, one of the world's strictest, was considered effective in curbing the spread of the virus. But in recent weeks, as restrictions have been gradually relaxed to protect the economy, the number of cases has soared nationwide. India's health ministry reported over 8,000 new cases on Monday, raising the total to over 265,000, the sixth highest in the world. The ministry also reported more than 200 deaths, taking the COVID-19 death toll to over 7,000.
Ultimately, whenever we are not healthy, also we always pray to the God so that they keep us healthy, wealthy and prosper. So that link was missing somehow. Today when the temple was open, everybody in this was in a mood which you can say we cannot explain.
An Iranian scientist returned home Monday after his release from a US jail in what the Islamic Republic said was a prisoner exchange it hopes could be repeated between the two countries. Majid Tahari, an Iranian-American who had been working on cancer research at a clinic in Tampa, Florida, was detained in the United States for 16 months. Tahari was freed on Thursday as Iran released US Navy veteran Michael White, who had been detained in the country since July 2018. Upon his arrival in Tehran, Deputy Foreign Minister Hussein Jaberi Ansari stated that he hoped to see the release of other Iranians imprisoned abroad in the near future and added that his ministry would do its best to achieve this.
We hope that this process of the full release of all Iranian prisoners in the United States will continue. As we have repeatedly stated, Iran is fully prepared to exchange all prisoners, and the United States government is responsible for this procrastination.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And you can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Katrina Goss, and thank you for watching.